Welcome everyone. So this is part 2 of the labor markets lecture, labor markets chapter and lecture. So here I'm going to think about labor supply, how to balance work and leisure, and then changing economic conditions and the labor market equilibrium. So the first thing, thinking about your labor supply curve, and you want to think really carefully about your role in the labor market. What you're doing now is increasing your human capital. You're investing in your education just actually as our character in the picture is doing. You want to think carefully about your decision between labor and leisure, right? So economists are going to think really broadly about leisure. It's basically anything, any activity, any time not spent working. Now, not all leisure is the same, right? The opportunity cost of working is everything you're doing when you're not working, right? So our character in the picture is not working. So it may not look like leisure, but it's what he'd give up if he was not working. What he's doing is not working. We would consider this leisure, but this is not like he's playing video games, right? This is actually contributing, studying is contributing very strongly to future earning potential. So whereas we're thinking of leisure as any time not spent working, you want to think really carefully about your leisure time, your time not spent working, and you want to think carefully about how you're using your time. You want to always be thinking really carefully. Some time is necessary to spend for relaxation, spend with friends and with family. You don't want to you're not optimizing your life by spending all your time working or all your time studying. However, you do want to think really carefully about the human capital investment in the value of studying for your future, because of what I'll show in future slides, thinking about the relationship between your own productivity and your ability actually not to work as much. All right, so you want to choose how many hours to work by thinking at the margin. Your labor supply curve depends on the balance of income and substitution effects. That's exactly what I'm referring to, right? All right, so we have a rational rule for buyers. We have a rational rule for sellers, a rational rule for employers, and now we have a rational rule for workers. The rational rule for workers is to work one more hour as long as the wage is at least as large as the marginal benefit from another hour of leisure. Now, there's a substitution effect. This measures how people might respond to changes in relative prices and say that higher wages makes work relatively more attractive. The income effect measures how people respond to changes in income and says higher income makes leisure more attractive. So I'm going to get into these ideas first by developing the graph. So panel A is an illustration of where the substitution... I feel like I was trying to come up with like a medium ground between like this being too big and too small relative to the ability to show this axis. So panel A is where the substitution effect dominates. So substitution effect is telling us a higher wage provides a stronger incentive to work, leading you to work more hours, right? So as your wage rises, think of your hourly wage per hour, your individual labor supply curve is probably upward sloping. The quantity axis is the quantity, the number of weekly hours, right? So as your hourly wage rises, maybe you want to work more, because think about the opportunity cost of working. Maybe your leisure activities weren't going to be that lucrative in the first place, and so you're willing to work more because you're being better compensated for it. And so as your hourly wage rises, maybe you want to work more hours. Okay. And so, but that's a substitution effect. When your income effect dominates, so a higher wage raises your income, and you spend this extra income buying more leisure. So this tends towards your labor supply curve being downward sloping, right? So as your hourly wage rises, at the higher hourly wage, maybe you want to work less, right? And there's a really interesting study between the substitution effect and income effect that gets referenced. I think it comes up in Freakonomics. In one of the Freakonomics podcasts, they talk about, so I should actually Google this really quick. Maybe you could do this and you could find it. There's a paper about taxi drivers, I think on rainy days. And you think about the interaction between the substitution effect and the income effect. So taxi drivers on a rainy day, there's a much greater demand for cab rides, right? And so you might think, because of the much greater demand for cab rides, you could get this effect where taxi drivers just work a lot on that day and are able to like maximize their income for that particular day. And I think what the findings of the paper was that actually it's hard to find a cab on a rainy day because people had this threshold as drivers that you want to hit. and you could hit it much earlier in the day on a rainy day, and then you just go home. And so that's interesting, thinking about the interaction between, you maybe have some threshold level that you want to hit, and once you've reached this, you work less. And so as your wage rises, maybe you buy back your time and you work less. That's where the income effect dominates. All right, with the income effect and substitution effect offset, you might get like a perfectly vertical labor supply curve where you just want to work a certain number of hours per week, and it doesn't matter what the wage is, right? Higher substitution effect leads you to work more hours. Higher income leads you to work fewer hours. And when they offset, you just work the same number of hours regardless of the wage. And that can happen in kind of like a lot of salaried positions, I suppose. So, all right. You could get a backward bending labor supply curve. So at low wages, the substitution effect dominates. At higher wages, this income effect becomes more important, right? So here's at very low wages, it's not worth working. You just rather stay at home. At higher wages, time is more scarce than money, so your income effect dominates, and you try to work fewer hours. In this middle part, the income effect and substitution effect are exactly offsetting. And as wage rises at the bottom part, this is like the upward sloping portion, the incentive to work rises, so the substitution effect dominates. It's interesting, like you should be able to sketch out the different regions of the backward bending labor supply curve and understand the intuition associated with each. You should also, kind of think about for yourself what your labor supply curve would look at. This is important because at this point, right, you're making labor market decisions for your future self. And you want to do this by careful reflection. You want to think about what it is you're working towards, right? So do that. Think about what your labor supply curve would look like, realizing that it could change like over the life cycle, right? It could change, will change over the life cycle, right? Also, your ability, your opportunity cost of working, the value of your leisure time is different at different times over the life cycle. Personally, I wish I spent a lot less time over the summers when I was in high school and college working at an amusement park. I was getting like $5.61 an hour. By the end, I was getting like $9 an hour. I worked there for like 8 years. I wish I would have spent, rather than spending sometimes 12, 13 hours a day at the amusement park, I wish I would have spent it learning something a lot more useful. Now, by my second year of college, I realized I should take the summer to study in advance for the more difficult classes I was taking in the future. So one of the reasons why I make videos, even before pandemic, and one of the reasons why I started making videos is because I benefited substantially from Gilbert Strang's videos, who is a professor at MIT. In advance of taking linear algebra, I bought the text. Turned out he'd been the author and had videos online from MIT, and I just watched his class. And I basically took his class on the summer before, and then I took it at my school in that fall, and did really well because I'd already did in the class. And there's relatively few. This is back in like 2002, so relatively few lecture videos online at that point. Is kind of before YouTube. And so that was really beneficial for myself. I now wish I would have done more of that then. And so that's one of the big reasons why I make my videos available, is for people that are interested in self-studying or to benefit like their own university study, or especially for my own students and so on and so forth. But just because that was really important for me back then and helped me do really well in my math classes. I was a math major, not an econ major. And I wish I would have spent a lot more of the time learning like programming languages. I wish I would have invested time back then to learn C++ and Java and so on and so forth, Python. And if I would have done that back then, it would have been way less costly to give up time spent working at the amusement park than it would be equivalently when I did later in life, giving up time spent with family and from working on teaching econ and so on and so forth. So one thing to really take to heart is the fact that the opportunity cost of your time now is different than at different points in life. And for working students and for students with families, it's a much different set of circumstances. And I certainly appreciate and recognize the opportunity cost of your time spent studying is really high. So, okay. Think about your labor supply curve. Think about your current part-time job or full-time job or whatever is the case. How many hours per week you choose to work if you got paid these different amounts. So think of what your labor supply curve would look like. How many hours are you willing to work at different wages? And you could discover what your own individual labor supply curve would look at. Look, you should think about this for the job that you're planning on working towards. Why do you think some labor supply curves slope upwards, some slope down? Why do you think some labor supply curves are nearly vertical for some people? Well, thinking about the trade-off between the income effect and substitution effect. So the individual labor supply, think carefully about whether or not to work. So think about the broad range of opportunity costs that come from working. Higher wages lead more people to enter the labor force. Think about at an occupational level. Think about applying the cost-benefit principle to choose and select the right occupation for you. Consider the benefits, doing what you love. Ask about the benefits. Think about the future. Think about your comparative advantage. Follow it. Consider the costs. Evaluate the risks. Consider volatility. Don't forget the hours involved. Right? All right. Practice question. When the labor supply is backward bending, when the wage is high, the income effect dominates the substitution effect. All right, that's the correct answer here. Market labor supply curve. The market labor supply curve slopes upwards for 3 reasons. Well, new people might be induced to enter the workforce as the wage rises. Existing workers might put in more hours as the wage rises, and some people might switch occupations to those with higher wages. Okay. So the market labor supply curve for hairstylists. Market labor supply curve reflects these 3 influences. When the wage is higher, existing hairstylists choose to work more hours. That's a substitution effect. That's also at the intensive margin. Those in the market are doing more is intensive margin, and this is a substitution effect. Existing hairstylists work more hours. Some may work fewer hours due to the income effect. That becomes the intensive margin or extensive margin. Sorry, intensive margin is existing market participants doing more or less. Intensive margin is people entering or leaving the market. Students, retirees, or homemakers might choose to return to the workforce. People may choose to become hairstylists rather than pursue other occupations. Consequently, the higher wage is associated with a larger quantity of labor supplied, yielding an upward market supply curve. All right, good. So the market labor supply curve overall, so not just thinking individual, but thinking at the market level, there's 4 factors that shift the market supply curve. Changing wages in other occupations, people switch fields. The number of potential workers, changes in numbers of the potential other workers, changes in the benefits of not working, and non-wage benefits, subsidies, and income taxes affect the market labor supply. So here's the shift in the market labor supply. Labor supply decreases when wages in competing jobs rise. People leave that and go into the other field. Labor supply increases when wages in competing jobs fall. Which of the following would increase the quantity of labor supplied moving along the labor supply curve? Oh, it's got to be wage, right? In the labor market for wage. If we're changing the quantity, if it's moving along the labor supply curve, it's got to be a change in wage, right? Wages for bakers rises. Yeah, that's right. All right. So now we'll think about, lastly, changing economic conditions in the labor market equilibrium. Evaluate how labor market will respond to changing economic conditions. All right, so looking at our labor market equilibrium, we have a 3-step process. So first is the labor supply or labor demand that's changing. Second, is it a shift in increase or decrease? Is it leftward or rightward? And then how will the wages and number of jobs change in the new equilibrium? All right, so here's kind of the picture for changing market condition. I don't know if I can move this over. The price of statistical software and powerful computers falls. What happens to the labor market for data analysts? We get an increase in demand. Cheaper price for a complementary capital leads to an increase in labor demand. Result, higher wages, more jobs. All right, McDonald's installs new kiosks in all the restaurants. Doesn't change the price of the burgers, so there's no scale effect. What happens to the demand for cashiers? Old demand, decreased demand. Substituting capital for labor is a decrease in labor demand. Lower wage, fewer jobs. All right, Congress passed an immigration bill reducing the number of foreigners with computer science degrees who can move to the United States. What happens to the labor market for programmers? Oh, there's a decrease in labor supply. Higher wage, fewer jobs. All right. Changing market conditions, here's some other examples. As the beef industry shrinks, the wages of large animal vets declined. What happens to the labor market for small animal vets? Well, people leave large animal vet practice and move into small animal, or make those decisions in college, in professional school. Large animal vets shift to working on small animals, or those who prospectively would have been, so we get a lower wage and more jobs. Congress increases the generosity of unemployment insurance. What happens to the labor market in most occupations? Decreased labor supply, higher wage, fewer jobs. Improvement in voice recognition software means that court stenographers are no longer needed. What happens to the labor market? Decrease in labor demand, lower wage, fewer jobs. Okay. So those are some good examples of changes in labor markets. There's more. Good. As baby boomers age, more people seek in-home elder care for their aging parents. What happens to the labor market for home health aides? Increase in demand. Increased labor demand, higher wage, more jobs. Some economists believe video games made leisure a lot more fun. What does this do to the labor market for young people? Decreased labor supply, higher wage, fewer jobs. Federal government raises the minimum wage to start collecting Social Security from 62 to 65. Happens to the labor market for older workers. Increased supply, so lower opportunity costs. Retirement is less tenable. Increase in labor supply, lower wage, more jobs. Nationwide budget shortfalls force many states to cut public school teacher pay. What happens to the labor market for private school teachers? Increased supply, lower wages, more jobs. Competition from Uber has forced limousine companies to cut their prices. What happens to the labor market for limo drivers? Decreased demand, lower wage, fewer jobs. Recession has led many colleges to reduce financial aid as they offer new students. What happens to the labor market for younger people? Increased labor supply, more expensive college lowers the opportunity cost to work. Lower lower wage, more jobs. Okay. So, all right, this is like the fourth video that I've made today, and I'm starving and thirsty and tired of sitting here. So, good to be on the last couple slides. All right. In some countries, the birth rate is now below the replacement rate. What does the implications have? There's fewer workers, decrease in labor supply, higher wage, lower jobs, right? Wages will rise and employment will fall is the correct answer. Key takeaways. The price of labor is the wage. Yes, the quantity of labor is the employment, hours of work. Labor demand. Demanders are the firms hiring workers. Supply is workers offering their time. Labor demand is equal to the marginal revenue product, which is the marginal product of labor. That's how much additional output from hiring one more worker times the market price of that output. The rational rule for employers says hire workers as long as the marginal revenue is greater than or equal to the wage. The rational rule for workers is to work more hours as long as the wage is greater than or equal to the marginal benefit of leisure. The shape of the individual supply curve depends on the substitution and income effects, and the labor market works just like other markets, but specifically for labor. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed, and actually think really carefully about your own labor market decisions. One thing that I like to do is counseling students thinking about what to major in, what the labor market looks like, is go to the BLS, Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Outlook Handbook and look this up for specific job categories, areas that you're interested in going into. I've got a video in my Economics for Your Life playlist where I kind of walk through that, but you could just kind of Google and search through that for yourself and just kind of look at the outlook for the major and for the career that you're headed towards, or that you might want to kind of build your skills and human capital towards entering. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the video, and then I'll see you next time.